Hey, tax fighters, this is Gage holding down the fort for the Taxpayer Army out in Saskatchewan. I decided today to bring on my colleague Carson from British Columbia to talk about how he got the BC carbon tax scrapped. We talk a lot about the federal consumer carbon tax, and the BC story is a little bit overshadowed. And as a guy who comes from a province that has always had governments that have stood against the carbon tax, it's really interesting to see the huge turnaround in BC and trying to figure out how taxpayers won that fight and how that pertains to the future. So, Carson, thanks for joining me. And if you could give a little quick spiel about how exactly the BC carbon tax works for people who didn't know and your role in that fight.
Yeah, absolutely, Gage. Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's always great to chat with you. So, BC had not just Canada, but North America's oldest carbon tax. Way back in 2008, the then BC Liberal government, led by a guy named Gordon Campbell, brought in North America's first consumer carbon tax. But at the time it was brought in, it was revenue neutral. That means for every dollar of revenue the carbon tax stole from British Columbians, there were tax cuts that corresponded with that revenue. So in British Columbia specifically, we saw income taxes going down as a result of this revenue neutral consumer carbon tax. But Gage, there's a problem with politicians. They like to tell fibs. And that's exactly what we saw in British Columbia. Before too long, the BC government, by this point, it was led by a woman named Christy Clark, whose name has been in the news a few times lately. Christy Clark's government started bundling all of these pre-existing tax credits into the formula they used to argue that the carbon tax was revenue neutral. So we'd had film tax credits on the books in BC since the 90s, but suddenly around 2014, 2013, Christy Clark started claiming that those tax credits were offsetting the carbon tax. So it was nonsense, right? British Columbians saw right through that. At the time, people were calling it a big accounting exercise. The carbon tax wasn't revenue neutral after that point. It was taking a lot more money from British Columbians than it was returning through tax cuts. And by the time the NDP got in power, they stopped pretending it was revenue neutral altogether. And by that point, it was costing British Columbians a whole lot of money. So that's sort of in very broad strokes, a history of the consumer carbon tax here in beautiful BC.
Okay, that all makes sense. But I remember we both started at the CTF around the same time. I remember we were talking kind of when we both started, like, so Carson, what's one of your goals? I remember you telling me that you wanted to crush the BC carbon tax because of how much it was costing British Columbia families. And, as a fellow tax fighter myself, I wished you the best of luck, but I knew that was going to be a big hill to climb. And it seems that so did some of the reporters when you first got on the job. You told me a really funny story about that on your first press conference about the carbon tax.
That's right, Gage. Yeah, my very first press conference as BC director for the CTF, I went down to Victoria, where our provincial capital is, called up all the journalists and told them we were going to be fighting the carbon tax. So we had the cameras out, we had journalists out, microphones in my face. And I told the press that we were calling on then Premier John Horgan to immediately cancel the carbon tax. Now, it's worth noting that when John Horgan was in opposition, when the Liberals were in power and the NDP were in opposition, John Horgan would rail against the carbon tax all the time. He said folks wouldn't be able to afford to heat their homes when the wild West Coast winds were howling, and he was right. But then as Premier, he kept jacking it up. So I held a press conference calling on John Horgan to end the consumer carbon tax in BC. And a journalist, from the CBC said, Carson, aren't you wasting my time and the Premier's time by even calling on him to cancel the carbon tax? Since he's been Premier, he's been its biggest cheerleader. Even the opposition, the BC Liberals, were in favor of the carbon tax. So across the political spectrum in BC, everyone was supporting the carbon tax. Everyone except the people who were paying the bills, Gage. And that's where the cracks started to emerge in the government's argument.
Right, and that's exactly right, because the politicians are out there making their six-figure salaries with their big expense accounts, as we both know, all across the country. They're not the actual people who are filling up their cars every day to work and getting hit with that carbon tax. So I think that's a really important point. So going forward, when we talked about your fight to the carbon tax, I think one of the most important things that you highlighted, along with the taxpayer army, is talking about how the BC carbon tax didn't work. The government said they were supposed to reduce emissions by a certain level, but you proved and you stood out in front of, I think, the legislative building again and put out the numbers and showed that it didn't work. And that was a really big turning point as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But I actually think the turning point came a little bit sooner than that. It came when we finally got the then official opposition, which had gone through a rebrand. They were called BC United now, not the soccer team, the political party. Um, Through writing op-eds, through getting our taxpayer army involved by sending emails and calling politicians, we were able to force the official opposition, the guys who brought in the carbon tax in the first place way back in 2008, to say, hold on, this policy isn't working. It's leaving people far worse off, and it's not revenue neutral. And for the folks in the rest of the country, we also weren't getting those rebates. The rebates in British Columbia only went to a really, really small cohort of the absolute lowest income earners, not to normal families. So getting the official opposition to finally say we don't support the carbon tax, I think that was a huge turning point. But the real big turning point, Gage, came when the government released its emissions data. Now, that was really important because we were able to use the government's own numbers to show that the carbon tax wasn't reducing emissions like they promised it would. Because when BC's carbon tax was brought in, the government actually passed a law, the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Act, which mandated that because of the carbon tax, emissions would go down by 33% between 2007 and 2020. Do you want to guess if that happened, Gager?
Well, I think I know the answer to that question, but I'll let you fill everybody else in.
Yeah, of course it didn't happen. Taxing Canadians, taxing British Columbians for heating our homes or driving to work, it's not going to meaningfully reduce emissions. And that's what we saw in British Columbia. And in fact, today, emissions are higher than before we brought in the carbon tax. So I went to Premier David Eby's constituency office here in Vancouver with two jerry cans. One of them said emissions up, the other one said carbon tax up. And we held a great press conference and really spread that message about how the carbon tax was not working.
Yeah, and I think those two turning points are a really important thing to talk about because, of course, we do our thing. We work hard every day to try and highlight some important things for tax fighters across the country and in our respective provinces. But to actually get the work done, as you mentioned, is it takes that taxpayer army, right? It takes people signing petitions, sending emails to politicians, so the politicians know that people can't afford this type of thing and they need to get rid of it. And that's a really big point that kind of underlined all the things that you're talking about with the work we're doing. And I think that's really important to talk about. The next thing is now we've seen the federal consumer carbon tax gone, and of course the BC consumer carbon tax gone. But across the country, the feds are still putting in a requirement for an industrial carbon tax. We've seen Saskatchewan, my home province, completely get rid of their industrial carbon tax, and things are starting to move in Alberta, where Danielle Smith put a freeze on their industrial carbon tax. So how important and how optimistic are you going forward that using the taxpayer army and all the tactics we know from beating the consumer carbon tax to win that next fight against the industrial carbon tax?
Well, Gage, the tax fighters did it once, and they're gonna do it again. Look, we already know that an industrial carbon tax, no matter how you want to tweak the language, is a carbon tax on Canadians, right? If you hike industrial carbon taxes on fertilizer factories, well, it gets more expensive for farmers to grow our food. If you hike carbon taxes on concrete factories, well, it gets more expensive to build new housing. And if you hike carbon taxes on utilities, well, then it makes it more expensive to heat your home. So Canadians understand that this hidden industrial carbon tax is a carbon tax on Canadians. And I think that's the first step. But the tax fighters proved that we can move the momentum on these big national policies that don't work, that make people poorer. And so I have every confidence that our tax fighting army is going to get another win against this industrial carbon tax.
Carson, I think so too. I remember telling us from our bosses and other people who've been involved in this fight for a long time that at the beginning, fighting the consumer carbon tax, it was Premier Brad Wall in Saskatchewan and the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And when it finally came tumbling down, almost every single person was against that consumer carbon tax, which is great to see what happens when taxpayers get together and fight against these policies that make life more expensive and don't actually fix any problems.
If I can jump in there, Gage, I mean, just look at British Columbia. 3 years ago, there was not a party in the provincial legislature where the leader would open their mouth and say carbon taxes are bad. Today in British Columbia, you can't find a political party where the leader will say the opposite. David Eby against the carbon tax now, the consumer carbon tax. Now he's still pushing that sneaky industrial carbon tax, which is the next fight that we're going to get him on. But he sees that the consumer carbon tax is bad. BC Liberals, BC United, they folded, they're gone. The new opposition, the BC Conservatives, well, they've been railing against the carbon tax for years now, too. So there is now broad-based political consensus, not just in BC, but across Canada, that consumer carbon taxes are bad. And we're going to win that fight against the industrial carbon tax, too.
Carson, that'll be a good day when that happens, but that kind of got me thinking about an interesting question to ask everybody who's watching this right now. In the last couple of years, when did you, as a regular tax fighter, hanging out and wherever you live, know that the consumer carbon tax was going to be dead and fuel was going to get cheaper, home heating was going to be cheaper? When did you know for sure that that was going to happen? Let us know what you think, and we'll read those comments.